This film deals with the booklet concerning medicine and treatment from 1750 to 1900 as part of the GCSE Medicine Through Time course at Plymstock School. Key words then that you need to know and be able to define for this particular booklet are as follows. Firstly, you studied in Year 8 and in Year 9 the Industrial Revolution, the period in British history when Britain turns from an agricultural, rural society into an urban, industrialised society. Mass movement of people from the countryside into the new urban, unplanned and unregulated cities. Governments that didn't take responsibility for how cities were planned failed to prepare the cities for this massive growth in population, leading to appalling public health crises in our cities. Smallpox, the killer disease of this particular part of history and periods before it, conquered by Edward Jenner at the end of the 18th century and the start of the 19th century. He discovered through the process of vaccination that by providing a patient with a dose of cowpox, the old wives' tale was true, that a person who catches cowpox would be immune to smallpox. This process was called vaccination. Inoculation is when you provide a weak dose of one disease to make the patient resistant to a stronger version of that particular disease. As governments became more involved and less laissez-faire during the 19th and 20th century, developments in inoculation made huge strides in extending life expectancy. Please refer back to your overview booklet, and of course improving the public health of people. Edward Jenner, as we discussed, the doctor who applied the scientific process to the development of a vaccine for smallpox. Louis Pasteur, the French biochemist, hired by the French wine industry to identify why their wine was going bad. In 1861, this led to his theory of germs being in the air, germ theory. Near enough to the nearest thing to a turning point in history as we will hope to find. Germ theory explained why people became ill. No one got better because of his work in germ theory, but in one fell swoop, with one simple experiment, Louis Pasteur destroys germ theory, destroys the theory of the four humours, destroys the concept of miasma. Robert Koch was Louis Pasteur's contemporary. Pasteur was French, Robert Koch was German. He built upon the work of Louis Pasteur and started to identify which germs cause which diseases. Again, not helping anyone get better, but one more step closer to finding a cure for people with illness. And germ theory was Louis Pasteur's theory of explaining that airborne particles are responsible for illness. Spontaneous generation was the belief that infection came from within the body, which again was destroyed by Louis Pasteur's germ theory. Florence Nightingale, the English upper-class young woman who challenged the stereotypes of the age in which she lived and revolutionized the practice of nursing, turning it from the lowest of jobs to the noblest of professions. Nursing, looking after the patients, again led by Florence Nightingale. The pharmacy, evolving from the medieval and Renaissance apothecary. As science evolves and knowledge improves, the apothecary becomes the pharmacy. Cholera, the waterborne 19th century disease that swept through British cities. The work of Dr. Snow helped identify that cholera was in the water that people were drinking. Unregulated cities with no access to fresh water and no sanitation led to cholera sweeping through British cities. Epidemic, obviously, cholera is an example, and you will have studied the Black Death going back to the previous booklet, when a disease is contracted by a large section of the population. And laissez-faire, the concept of governments not doing anything to help their people. the idea that government should be small and non-interfering. During the 19th century, laissez-faire breaks down, and during the 20th century, completely destroyed, as the government take on more and more responsibilities, culminating in the 1948 National Health Service, where the British government provided care from the cradle to the grave for its people. Okay, your first task was to look at the picture, A Court for King Cholera, an illustration of life in a British city during the 19th century. Identify all the things that are wrong with this particular scene in terms of its consequences for people's health and medicine. As you identify each of these facts, explain, analyze why what you are observing would be bad for people's health or people's medicine. Task 2, using the textbook. Complete the mind map below. What illnesses and how were they spread? Ideas like cholera and typhus. What did people think caused these illnesses? It's going to be remarkably similar to the work that you studied in previous booklets from the Renaissance. Bad air. The act of God. An imbalance in the four humours. And how was cholera treated when people didn't actually know what the cause of cholera was? Again, be thinking about that notion from the medieval booklet that if you believe your cause is superstitious, chances are your cure will be superstitious as well. And in the extension task, compare then your work on the Black Death and how it was treated to how cholera was treated in the 19th century. Are they doing anything different in each of these periods? Or is in fact there a great deal of continuity despite there almost being 1,000 years between these two outbreaks? Moving on then, the story of Jenner and the development of vaccination. You have to identify the words that filter their way through. In a separate colour, explain why those words are correct, and then moving on. The opportunity to storyboard the story of the breakthrough against smallpox. Once the story is completed, look at these separate themes to explain how Jenner succeeded in his breakthrough. Chance, the fact that he could even dare to practice an experiment on a child in the way he was doing so. Chance that he came across the story, the old wives' tale that those people who suffered from cowpox didn't catch smallpox. Experimentation, how he used the scientific process, posed a question, tested that question, experimented that question, repeated his experiments. How he shared the knowledge that he had found, how he got his work published. And then how the government, upon hearing of what he'd done, supported the work that he'd undertaken, rewarded him, and started the first major vaccination process against a disease in world history. Now then, the extension to this is what limitations were there with Edward Jenner's work. Well, firstly, no one understood why it worked. And secondly, when one looks back at how smallpox is prevented by cowpox, it's clear to see that it was a dead end. We can't identify any other diseases that prevent other diseases. So in other words, vaccination stopped. The next set of breakthroughs will be made through the process of inoculation, using weakened forms of a disease to prevent a stronger infection. Task 3, rather like the court for King Cholera earlier on, we see how the media are increasingly playing a role in spreading information and ideas during the Industrial Revolution, be it the cartoon at the start or the cartoon that we have here. The public reaction to Jenner's discovery would have been in large part led and dictated by what people would be seeing in newspapers and magazines. In this particular illustration, all of the people being vaccinated by Jenner have cows growing out of them, on their noses, horns on their head, out their mouth, out their arms, even worse down here. The idea then that people would have been scared of change. So once again, as we saw with the work of Vesalius, Paré and Harvey in the Renaissance, people were conservative, scary, and wary of change. Okay, moving on then to the mid-19th century. Pasteur's discovery of germ theory, working through the bite-sized film contained on the learning area and the textbook, complete the closed statements listed below. And remind yourself of the simple experiment that Pasteur carried out to prove that germs in the air were making the yeast in the containers go bad. How then did the work of Louis Pasteur lead to the development of vaccines? Sequence the statements in the correct order. And despite the relative simplicity of providing weak doses of a disease to prevent a stronger outbreak, obviously it's more complicated than that. The time taken to make the breakthroughs in vaccines in all of these diseases show that it was a long process. But we see in our journey from Jenner's breakthrough with smallpox but not knowing how it worked, and then reaching a dead end, through to the work of Pasteur identifying germs, Robert Koch identifying which germs cause which disease, and then consequently back to Pasteur and Koch again as they start to develop vaccines. Why was Pasteur's work a turning point? Well, as with all of these questions, why was it a turning point? Why was it a significant change? And balance it out with why it was a trend. It was a turning point because his discovery explained illness in a completely scientific and accurate way. It replaced older notions of the four humours and miasma straight away. But it was a trend because, like all new discoveries, it takes time for people to accept the views. People are conservative and resistant to change, and also it still takes time, despite the printing press, for ideas to be shared. Next one then, the role of Florence Nightingale in the development of nursing. How nursing went from an extremely bad profession into an extremely highly regarded profession. Identify here all the things listed above that were wrong with nursing. Then read the story of Florence Nightingale, colour coding it please for each of these themes. Again, the role of government, thinking about laissez-faire, not getting involved. Religion still apparent, even though not as important in the 19th century as it was during the Renaissance. And looking at how Florence Nightingale improved nursing. From the first scene here to the clean and efficient wards she introduced afterwards. Once nursing had been reformed, the next logical step was maybe women becoming doctors. And they study here the changing role of women in the history of medicine, now looking at Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. What difficulties did women face in their pursuit to become doctors? Very much the same difficulties that Nightingale would have faced in changing nursing. A male-dominated society, a conservative society that didn't like change, and a society that didn't allow women access to the education they would actually require in order to become the kind of people that could change things. And of course, finally, women were denied the vote. They couldn't elect a government that would bring about changes favourable to them. Complete the biography of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. And one paragraph, please, PEA, on why she was important. Then an overview of women and medicine in the 20th century, considering the factors as to why women increasingly play a greater role. Then, for all the developments in nursing and women in doctors, how did it affect hospitals? How advanced were hospitals at this point? What limitations were there on what they could do and they could provide? Well, you must recall that hospitals were charities. They weren't funded by the government. The government was still laissez-faire, so they were limited. What limitations were there on what they could provide? Well, they could provide no more than knowledge allowed at the time. You've already seen in this booklet that there weren't vaccinations for many diseases well into the 20th century. Even if they could provide treatment, it could be limited by the amount of money they had. So how advanced were the hospitals? When you view the film, what could they do? What couldn't they do? Were there any similarities between the two films, despite them being so different in content and time? Then complete the gap fill and contemplate changes in the right to vote. How would the people being able to vote during the 20th century and 19th century affect the treatment of the poor? And also, why would wealthier people oppose these changes? Lesson 8, looking at the development of medicines and how medical breakthroughs led to the mass production of drugs, which improved the treatment of medicine and required the government to take a more involved role in regulating this profession. And then finally, how did, in this overview task, all these factors contribute to changes in the medical profession?